The receipt in her purse was dated 4 days after she vanished, and the surveillance footage showed exactly who bought it. Her husband, alone, buying a single drink. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, and from the moment Asha Davis heard her sister's employer on the other end of the line, she knew something had gone terribly wrong. Leslie Herring had not shown up for work. For 11 years, Leslie had never missed a single day. She was the kind of employee who arrived early, stayed late, and never gave anyone reason to question her reliability. The woman on the phone sounded concerned, almost apologetic, as if she was embarrassed to be making this call. But Asha felt no embarrassment. She felt a cold weight settle in her chest, a sensation she would later describe as knowing before knowing. She immediately began calling family members, starting with her brother Lyndon. The Telford family was close, unusually close by most standards, and they had built their lives around a simple principle. When one of them needed help, the others showed up. Leslie had always been the one who showed up first. She was the organizer, the planner, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries and made sure everyone felt loved. So when she didn't answer her phone, when her voicemail picked up on the first ring, when the hours stretched into days without a single word, the family knew they were facing something they had never faced before. They tried Lyall next. They called his office at Cal State Northridge. They called his cell phone. They drove to the condominium near Hollywood where the couple lived. The door was locked. The lights were off. The neighbors hadn't seen anyone for days. Leslie Telford was born in Guyana, a small country on the northern coast of South America, and she arrived in America as a young girl with nothing but the clothes on her back and the dreams her parents had carried across the ocean. Her family had come seeking opportunity, seeking safety, seeking a future that was not guaranteed in the land they left behind. Leslie absorbed those dreams and made them her own. She worked harder than anyone around her. She studied, she saved, she built a life from the ground up. By the time she reached adulthood, she had become the anchor of the Telford family, the one everyone turned to when things fell apart. Her brother Lyndon described her as the rock-solid one of the bunch. She had zero tolerance for nonsense, he said, but she always wore a smile. She was the organizer, the mother hand, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly. Leslie's sister, Asha Davis, found success as an actress, appearing in films and television shows that brought her a measure of fame. But in the Telford family, there was no hierarchy of achievement. Leslie was just as valued, just as loved. She worked a desk job at a home security company in Los Angeles, a steady job that paid the bills and allowed her to live comfortably. At 44 years old, Leslie had achieved the American dream. She had a career, she had a husband, she had a beautiful condominium near Hollywood, she had a 60-foot sailboat that she took out on the water with friends and family. She had everything she had ever wanted. Lyndon Telford and the other men in the Telford family had always been suspicious of Lyall Herring. They couldn't put their finger on exactly what bothered them, but they knew something was wrong. Lyall was charming, no doubt about that. He knew how to talk to people, how to make them feel important, how to win them over with a smile and a well-placed compliment. The women in the family fell for it completely. They thought Lyall was a special guy, a wonderful husband, a perfect match for their sister. But the men were not convinced. They watched Lyall closely. They observed how he interacted with people, how he moved through social situations, how he seemed to always be performing. There was something about this guy, they said. He's up to something. We just can't put our finger on it. They used a word to describe him that stuck in the family's memory. They called him a smooger. It was a term that meant something specific to them. A smooger was a man who was too smooth, too slick, too good to be true. A smooger was a man you kept your wives and girlfriends locked up around. The men in the Telford family had instincts, and their instincts told them that Lyall was not to be trusted. But what could they do? Leslie loved him. Leslie had chosen him. She had built a life with him. They couldn't interfere in their sister's marriage based on a vague feeling of unease. So they kept their suspicions to themselves. They smiled at family gatherings. They shook Lyall's hand. They pretended everything was fine. But they never stopped watching. They noticed how Lyall talked about money, always hinting at deals and opportunities, but never providing details. When detectives from the Hollywood Police Department entered Lyall and Leslie Herring's condominium, they found a space that was almost too clean. The furniture was arranged neatly. The surfaces were dusted. The floors were polished. It looked like a showroom, not a home. But there were small details that didn't fit. On the kitchen counter, there was a significant amount of spilled candle wax, as if a candle had tipped over and melted across the surface. It was a mess, an unusual mess in an otherwise immaculate space. Detective Chris Gable noticed it immediately. He had already learned a few things about Leslie Herring from her family. She was meticulous. She was organized. She did not leave things out of place. That candle wax should not have been there. It was a small detail, but it was the first crack in the facade of normalcy. The detectives searched the rest of the condo carefully. They opened closets. They looked under beds. They checked the bathrooms, the laundry room, the storage areas. They found nothing out of the ordinary, at least at first. But as they dug deeper, as they opened drawers and cabinets, they began to uncover clues. In a bedside drawer, they found a letter from Leslie to Lyall. The contents were devastating. Leslie was furious about Lyall's financial dealings. She wrote that she couldn't take anymore. She was broken. She wanted out of the marriage. The letter painted a picture of a woman who had reached her limit. Leslie was done. She was ready to leave. And that made her a threat to Lyall. If she left, she could expose his problems. She could ruin his reputation. She could take everything. Inside Leslie's purse, detectives found a receipt from a local Starbucks. The receipt was dated on a Tuesday night, 4 days after Leslie had disappeared. That was impossible. How could a receipt from 4 days after her disappearance be in her purse? The detectives stared at it, trying to make sense of it. They knew Leslie had been missing since the previous Saturday. They knew her family had been frantic for days. They knew she had not been seen or heard from by anyone who loved her. But here was a receipt dated Tuesday, suggesting she had been alive and well 4 days after she vanished. The detectives immediately suspected a trick. They suspected Lyall. They rushed to the Starbucks to check the surveillance footage before it was erased. The store manager cooperated willingly, pulling up the video from that Tuesday night. The detectives watched the footage, searching for any sign of Leslie. They hoped they would see her walking in, ordering a drink, going about her life. They hoped they would find proof that she was still alive. But Leslie never appeared. Instead, they found Lyall. He walked in alone, dressed casually, looking calm and collected. He ordered a single drink. He paid with cash. He took the receipt and placed it in his pocket. Then he left. There was no sign of Leslie. There was no sign that she had been with him. There was only Lyall, buying a drink and leaving with a receipt that would later be found in his wife's purse. The detectives knew immediately what they were looking at. Lyall had planted the receipt. He had gone to Starbucks, bought a drink, and placed the receipt in his wife's purse to make it look like she was still alive. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Lyall Herring's personal computer and cell phone. The digital evidence they uncovered was disturbing. Lyall had been searching the internet for topics that no innocent man should be searching for. He had looked up profiles of mass murderers. He had researched violent death in the soul. He had investigated 10 common methods of suicide. The searches were clinical, methodical, as if Lyall was conducting research for some dark project. He wanted to understand death. He wanted to understand how people killed themselves, how they killed others, how the soul departed from the body. These were not the searches of a worried husband frantically looking for his missing wife. These were the searches of someone planning something, someone trying to cover his tracks, someone who had already made the decision to end a life. The detectives were chilled by what they found. They had seen a lot of disturbing things in their careers. They had investigated murders, rapes, kidnappings. But the cold, calculating nature of Lyall's searches was something else. He wasn't acting out of passion or rage. He was acting out of design. He was thinking about this. He was planning this. The phone records were even more damning. In the days after Leslie's disappearance, there were several calls between Leslie's phone and Lyall's phone. At first glance, it looked like a husband and wife staying in touch. But detectives tracked the cell tower usage and discovered that both phones were side by side during those calls. Lyall was holding one phone and calling the other. He was creating the illusion that Leslie was still alive. He was manufacturing evidence of her existence. He was, in effect, talking to himself. A neighbor from Lyall and Leslie's condominium complex came forward with a story that stunned the detectives. The neighbor said that around midnight on the night of Leslie's disappearance, he had seen Lyall in the hallway. Lyall was wheeling a dolly down the corridor toward a far-back elevator. On the dolly was a rolled-up carpet, wide enough to contain a body. The neighbor described the scene in vivid detail. Lyall had a crazy look on his face, he said. He was wearing a hoodie pulled up over his head. He was sweating, even though the hallway was cool, and he didn't acknowledge the witness. He didn't say hello. He didn't make eye contact. He just kept moving, pushing that dolly toward the elevator with a desperate urgency. The neighbor was unsettled by what he saw. He thought about calling the police, but he convinced himself he was overreacting. He convinced himself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Lyall was moving furniture. Maybe he was cleaning out a storage unit. Maybe there was nothing to worry about. But the image stayed with him. The carpet, the dolly, the strange look on Lyall's face. When he learned that Leslie had disappeared, the memory came flooding back. He called the police immediately. The detectives listened to his story with growing excitement. This was the break they had been waiting for. This was the evidence that would crack the case. They asked the neighbor if he was sure about what he had seen. He said he was absolutely certain. He described the carpet in detail. He described the dolly. He described the route Lyall had taken. He described the expression on Lyall's face. The detectives knew they were looking at the moment Leslie's body had been removed from the condo. The detectives called in a specialist to help them find the body. Indiana Bones was a cadaver dog, a trained animal capable of detecting the scent of human remains. She had been used in dozens of investigations and had an impressive track record of success. The detectives brought her to the condominium complex to search Lyall's vehicles. The cars were parked about 200 yards apart in separate garages. Indiana Bones was first brought to Lyall's old vintage Cadillac. She sniffed the exterior. She sniffed the trunk. She sniffed the interior. Then she gave a positive hit. There was decomposition in that car. The scent of death was present. The dog was then brought to Lyall's Mitsubishi SUV, parked in a different garage. She gave another positive hit. Both vehicles contained the scent of human remains. The detectives developed a theory based on the dog's findings. They believed Lyall had murdered Leslie in the condo and then taken her body down to the Mitsubishi SUV. He had placed her in the back of the vehicle and driven to the garage where the vintage Cadillac was parked. He had transferred the body to the Cadillac, perhaps thinking the older car would be less noticeable. He had driven back to the condo to clean up. Then, once he figured out what he was going to do with her, he had put the body back into the Mitsubishi and used that vehicle to discard her remains. The cadaver dog's hits confirmed that Leslie's body had been in both vehicles. It was a devastating piece of evidence. The dog's nose didn't lie. The scent of decomposition was unmistakable. Leslie had been in those cars. She had been transported in those cars. And now she was somewhere else. Somewhere Lyall had taken her. 2 days after the GPS tracker was installed, Lyall led the detectives to a remote area in Griffith Park. It was around 6 o'clock in the morning. The park was quiet. There was no one around. Lyall got out of his car and walked to an area where there were a couple of dumpsters. He walked around the dumpsters. He looked at the ground. He looked at the surrounding area. He stood there for a few minutes, just staring. Then he got back in his car and drove away. The detectives moved in immediately. They brought Indiana Bones back to the area where Lyall had been standing. The dog gave a positive hit on a dirt mound about 15 feet from one of the dumpsters. The detectives began digging. They were excited. They were hopeful. They were sure they were about to find Leslie's body. They dug and they dug. They moved shovelful after shovelful of dirt. They went down 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. But they found nothing. The dirt mound yielded no remains. The dumpsters had been emptied into the massive Los Angeles landfill. If Lyall had placed Leslie's body in one of those dumpsters, it was gone forever. The detectives were devastated. They had come so close. They had been one shovelful of dirt away from cracking the case, but the body was gone. The dumpsters had been collected and the contents had been taken to the landfill. They would never find her. The detectives realized what had happened. Lyall had backed his Mitsubishi into the area. He had placed Leslie's body on the dirt mound. He had waited until the dumpsters were emptied. Then he had transferred her body to the dumpster. It was a calculated plan, executed with precision. Lyall had thought of everything. He had chosen a location where the dumpsters were regularly emptied. He had waited for the right moment. He had disposed of the body in a place where it would never be found. After 14 months of investigation, the detectives had gathered enough evidence to arrest Lyall Herring. They drove to his office at Cal State Northridge. They told him something had happened to his car so he would come outside. He did, and then they handcuffed him. Lyall was shocked. He didn't expect to be arrested. He thought he had covered his tracks. He thought he had gotten away with it. But he was wrong. Los Angeles Deputy District Attorney Sam Holfeld handled the prosecution. He faced a unique challenge. Most murders start and end with a body. In this case, there was no body. The prosecution had to build a case without the most fundamental piece of evidence. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The neighbor's testimony about the dolly and the carpet. The cadaver dog hits on both vehicles. The cell phone records showing Lyall had called himself. The internet searches for murder methods. The Starbucks receipt Lyall had planted in Leslie's purse. The wet towels in the bathroom. The confession to the cousin. The GPS tracker leading Lyall to Griffith Park. The prosecution presented all of this evidence to the jury. They laid out the case methodically, step by step. They showed the jury that Lyall had planned the murder. He had researched it, he had executed it, and he had tried to cover it up. The defense argued that there was no proof Leslie was dead. They argued that she could have run away. They argued that Lyall was innocent, but the jury didn't believe them. After a 3-week trial, the jury reached a verdict. Lyall Herring was guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Leslie's body has never been found. Her family still hopes that Lyall might one day do the right thing. They hope he might reach out and tell them where she is. But Lyall has remained silent. Her life impacted them. She will always be in their hearts and souls and minds, forever.